Hello and welcome back. It is Monday, February 4th. This is another episode of the Underscored podcast with Stephen Kent. I am Stephen Kent, spokesperson for Young Voices and host of this here podcast. We've got a lot to talk about today. We're going to focus a little bit on a scandal that came up over the weekend involving the Virginia Governor Ralph Northam. He's a Democrat. Wow, he had a heck of a time. So, where to begin? So on Friday, news breaks that a conservative website dug up a yearbook photo or situation, a spread of Ralph Northam in his med school yearbook in 1984. Images depict a couple, things of Ralph Northam in cowboy boots, cowboy hat, sitting by a car, sitting under a tree, and then on the right panel, a photo of two unidentified individuals, one in full blackface and the other dressed up as a Klansman. Ralph Northam first says he apologizes for the photo, not saying who in the photo he is, and then 24 hours later walks it back to say, I was not in this photo, but in a press conference saying, I have done blackface before. The same time in my life, the same year as that photo was taken, I dressed up as Michael Jackson and used shoe polish on my cheeks to portray him in a dance contest, and he won. And he almost moonwalked during the press conference. It was something to behold. Joining me today to talk about this is Matthew Larosiere of Young Voices. He normally writes about all things gun. He is himself a gun, but he did write one piece in December of last year that was not about firearms, titled It's Time to Rediscover Political Forgiveness in the American Conservative. Matthew, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, how you doing, Stephen? It's good to hear you. And we're definitely at an interesting point in politics when we need a gun to tell us to be more forgiving.
Yeah, well, it's always nice to have a real gun on the show. So thanks for coming on to talk to me about this. It's a little outside your usual wheelhouse, but man, is it relevant, because this is such a bizarre scandal. I think just because of just how weird it has become and how many twists and turns there have been in it. And it's like, it's not even a sex scandal. It's just sort of this racism flap from a Democratic governor's past. But what made it so fascinating was, kind of as I laid out, is like he apologized for it, then denied it, and then admitted to a similar grievance that is not depicted in the yearbook.
Yeah, which immediately went to reenact, which is just fascinating. And also, it's interesting that this was in the yearbook and published in the yearbook to begin with. You'd think even by 1984 standards, that would be something that would, not make the final cut.
Yeah, I've sort of been saying since the beginning. I don't know. I guess I'm just interested in who is the editor of the yearbook, and I really want to know the decision-making process about why that photo was included at all, and then who has the knowledge of whether or not it is Governor Ralph Northam in that photo. Because that is fascinating. And frankly, since he has denied it and said that it was an error, I think we will eventually get to hear from the people involved in the yearbook at his med school. So I think that is sort of forthcoming. But Matt, you're doing a TV interview later today on that piece of yours that I mentioned, dating back to December. The backdrop of that was sort of the midterm elections, Beto O'Rourke, Brett Kavanaugh, and the importance of political forgiveness. You write of scandals involving public officials past, and you say, we must accept an uncomfortable fact. The only people who will survive such thorough opposition research are either ill-socialized Boy Scouts or utterly shameless individuals. It's an insane way to pick our leaders, and instead of becoming comfortable with it, we should focus on what actually matters: relevant qualifications. So, Matt, what should happen with Governor Ralph Northam in your view?
Well, okay, so let's make something clear. That's really racially insensitive what he did, back in 1984. However, my question is, are we going to live in a society where the rule is you cannot be forgiven, period? Right? I think that's a question to be had. And the answer, to a lot of people, the answer might be yes. But if the answer is no, which I certainly hope it is, because I don't think anyone can survive absolute scrutiny, is what is enough to make up for it? Is it an apology? Clearly not, because he has apologized. Is it what if somebody had either done blackface 30 years ago or made an insensitive joke or something, and then they become a civil rights lawyer working closely with the NAACP. Um,
Yeah.
how many years doing that sort of service would it be until they were no longer a racist? When
Yeah,
did it
until it
stop?
canceled out
Yeah,
that previous sin, like if you
yeah,
just look at it like a ledger or sort of balancing the scales, like, yeah, so maybe they were like a really problematic teenager, and then they go on to be an ACLU lawyer and do nothing but serve underprivileged and you know communities of color.
right,
Like, yeah, exactly. Like, are you gonna assert that they're a racist, or are you gonna assert that they were a dumb teenager? Um, that's sort of always been the issue, and Me Too has sort of been centered around this same problem, which was, if you are in violation of social norms, if you are an affront to women that you work with or such, are you able to atone for that and
hmm
say, like, wow, I didn't realize how wrong and gross I was being,
right,
and I would like to try this again. We sort of have a current mode of justice, which has basically just sort of been excommunication and banishment without any sort of ending in sight.
right. Yeah, and how many people are we going to lose that way? You might be a terrific and perfect Boy Scout, but and but not. I don't know how many people are like that. I don't remember much of high school. It was a long time ago, and I don't think very many interesting things happened. But I remember a lot of edginess. When you're young and in college too, and you first discover you can make people laugh by being horrible.
tr- by
Right.
transgressing. Yeah, I mean that's sort of the nature of being young, is transgressing against social norms and things that you're expected to do. Now, it is worth saying that in Virginia in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and really
Right.
everything before, this is not something you would consider transgressing, dressing in blackface. This is just sort of something that I think for a long time was considered to be
Right.
funny. And I mean that in a sense of condemnation, not saying that it's not transgressing. I just, at that time, it was normalized, it
Exactly.
was wrong, and it was gross. But in general, we talk about sort of young people as if they're supposed to have everything figured out, as if they're supposed to be smart and wise and be
hmm
thinking about their futures. And we all know that that is not the case. People are always flirting with the self
Right.
destruct button
Well, you
when they
can't
are
see that
young.
far ahead when you haven't lived that long. It's probably hard. They probably think they're still thinking about their future, but they can't. When you're a college age, and I know this was med school, and I try to keep things in more general today terms because getting into your culpability for practicing things that were considered socially acceptable in a different time is a whole different can of worms. But what's the cutoff here? There has to be something,
Yeah, well, you make this point in the piece about the relevancy of a past wrongdoing to do the job of
right?
holding public office. Uh, but that seems a little bit off to me, honestly. So, like, Beto O'Rourke had this theater review from 1991 that you talk about, where he heaped praise on the buttocks and breasts of women in a play, and then sort of tearing apart their acting in the play itself. And it got some blowback during the campaign, kind of moderate, but isn't the point that Americans today would like to not get burned by yet another skeezy politician who sort of turns out to be a creep in office? And finding stuff like that is valuable in today's society, because we are tired of being embarrassed by the people that we elect. We want to know more about them and sort of those transgressions. Like Kavanaugh's drinking in high school and college could even be seen as relevant if you're talking about a
Right.
guy who would go blackout drunk when he's being tapped for a job that is based around judgment and measured thinking.
Right. So you've got a lot of points there, and the whole point is having the discussion of what does this mean for the job. And I'm not gonna mince words here. If you are a racist, that is disqualifying for being the governor of a state. Period. But we need to discuss. Okay, instead of just we know that being you can't be a racist and be a governor. That's not acceptable. But is this information we have here relevant, to proving that this person is presently a racist? or it has any other disqualifying factors. Like you said, if we had proof that he was an alcoholic, we'd also want to look into that. But the interesting thing about this part is this is getting into politics that are commonly found on the left. This sort of no forgiveness type identity stuff. But this is being spearheaded, I feel, in this situation by people on the right. Like it seems this is being
Yeah.
weaponized as a mechanism against his abortion stance that he took.
Yeah, there's
So
been a little bit of
yeah.
that, like sort of taking this out on Northam because of the week's earlier scandal involving abortion, and then also I think conservatives, certain conservatives, are very eager to sort of balance the scales in terms of like which side has to fend off racism claims,
Right.
and then they sort of abandon their previously held position that people make mistakes and that they should be allowed to atone for them, because you normally hear this from the right because frankly they just have sort of more offenders that they have to deal with. Tends to have been the
Mhm.
case. um, but so going back a little bit, you see this as we're just asking the wrong questions. Like the question of whether or not he should resign is the wrong question. The thing that we need to discuss is, what does this offense mean, and sort of, I don't know, like how do you frame that in terms of who he is then and who he is now? Like, how do you have that discussion?
Well, what these always come with is with some new piece of information that comes out. So then we have to look at that piece of information critically and have a discussion with ourselves, or a national discussion if it has to be, saying, what does this mean? What is the current significance of this piece of information?
Yeah.
If you can't decide on that, it's just nonsense. We can come up and say he had a pet rock. That means he's anti animals and whatever,
Uh-huh.
and then everyone can agree. And if everybody agrees, then that'll be what the fact is.
you
If you don't have a civil discussion about it to begin with, then you're going to wind up with garbage on the other
you seem like a person who might have grown up with a pet rock. Just a
end.
personal fan theory that I have. Not, I'm just kidding. So but
Always had a dog.
so isn't the problem here the 2020 election, and that the people who kind of came out first to then start the throwing under the bus of Ralph Northam, was these people running for president who really sort of have to set the tone about who represents the Democratic Party? Because I believe in forgiveness and what you've written about, but there's no reason why Democrats should have to suffer this kind of handicap from a governor in Virginia, that they need to be effective. You can just throw them under the bus and not have to deal with them. From a political sort of shrewd standpoint, that seems to be relatively true.
Right. But what is the tactical advantage here? And you have to think about, moving forward. How is this going to be used? Because it's today you, it's tomorrow me. Do these people all have perfect houses? They don't have any skeletons that they need to be worried about. I think that what no, it can't, with something so sensitive as this type of issue, this total categorical lack of forgiveness, where you've made a mistake and now you have to go you have to go disappear, which is what the result has been in the past. People need to take a more active stance in not immediately forgiving them, but in being more critical of the information, and saying, okay, what is the relevance of this information? Right. I don't think we should ever just throw them under the bus.
So you talk a lot about relevance, and I guess I want to know, just where does public trust factor into relevancy? Because when you're the governor of Virginia, you have to have the trust of your
Right.
party, the trust of people who represent similar constituencies, and you have to have the trust of your voters. It isn't that the entire point, and shouldn't, in the case of Ralph Northam, public trust be sort of tied to the relevancy of the offense?
Yes, it should be. But that comes as part and parcel of your discussion of the offense. Like
Hmm.
it could be if he comes out and says, and this is still developing. We don't know exactly who it was in the photo or whatever. But if he categorically says that's not me, I never had anything to do with that, and then it came out later, you know, that he
Yeah.
had done the Michael Jackson thing, that would be current
Yeah.
evidence of his lack of honesty, of his inability to handle the situation. But I think he probably handled it pretty well. If he was unsure who it was, he did immediately apologize, condemn the activity, and he had a memory of doing it in the past, and so he was forthright with it. He said, "I did it. It was wrong, and and that's the way it is. What more can you ask of somebody aside from that they walk down the street, hitting themselves with a whip? Is that what do we want?
Why can't we have average Joes who represent the people, and have a history that does not involve blackface or sort of a Klansman in your yearbook? Like, again, like Ralph Northam, I feel really bad in a sense for the guy. Like, this really came out of nowhere, and it's sort of been a total mess where he hasn't been able to prove his innocence regarding the yearbook. But
Yeah.
there are other people who can be the governor of Virginia and not have this thing hang over their head. It's obviously an extreme example, but I imagine you take my
Right.
point. Can't you have a
It's a very extreme
yeah,
example, and there are a lot of people who could be the governor of Virginia, and I'd say that probably the vast and sweeping majority don't have anything like this in their closet. But what do they have in their closet? Is it a function of is this really? I mean, this is an extreme example, but moving forward, what's it going to be?
yeah,
Is it going to be they made a bad joke? I'd say it's got to be at least half of people that have made like a really off color joke at some point in their lives.
yeah,
uh, what's it going to be?
yeah.
That's the
So
question.
I guess to round this out, how do you sort of see the prospects of millennials and Gen Zers who gear up to run for office? We were already seeing some people give this a try, and we've sort of seen really bad takedowns of politicians like Ocasio
Right.
Cortez in the form of like that dancing video. These generations' lives have been documented and shared on social media. My life has been very well documented online. Are there going to be problems for us running down the road?
For millennials, I think absolutely, especially because our generation, millennials, are very much are very sensitive to these types of issues, regardless of what we might have said or done. When we were growing up in the late '80s or '90s, things were not as different as Virginia in '84, but they were certainly different.
Hmm.
I think so. I think millennials are going to have a problem. But remember, what I said in that article is that there's two sides of this. You can have the Boy Scout Joe who has a clean past, but on the other end, you're going to have the shameless people. And I think that Gen Z people, they have shown in the media that they consume and in generally how they interact with each other that they are very they tend to be very politically incorrect compared to previous generations.
Yeah, we're
So I think
talking about younger than millennials.
right.
This kind of like YouTube generation that's
Yeah,
coming up
the
right
people
now.
who watch
Yeah,
PewDiePie, which is he's one of
yeah,
the most subscribed channels of people of this generation, and all he does is scream and swear, the whole time.
uh
So
huh.
when those people come start running for office, I think you're going to see if it doesn't trend towards that direction slowly, you're going to see a
Hmm.
sudden about face, which I think could be just as bad as
Do
having a
you
million
consider
of them.
that to be in the category of shameless, or do you sort of, does that count as shamelessness to you, to like the Gen Z sort of approach, or is that like authenticity? What does that mean to you?
You know what? I'm not sure. It has to be measured in the context of the society at the time. So
Yeah.
right now in the political sphere, somebody who behaves that way, we call them shameless because it's just not what we're expecting.
Yeah.
It breaks the mold completely. Uh, but I don't know what politics are going to look like once people born after the new millennium are in their 40s and starting to run for office. It might be
My God. Yeah.
it might be just par for the course.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with your analysis here. Like, millennials are sort of in this weird middle point between the generations where we sort of have to deal with old guard sort of champions of civility or, like good behavior in politics and in life. But I do think Gen Z is going to be that group that comes up where everything from the cradle to the grave has been
Right.
online, and there's going to be like a mutual understanding possibly that, yeah, we all have a lot of stuff on the internet, so it almost all cancels out, where right now you have young candidates running for office and their older opposition are the ones dredging up all of their Facebook statuses and yearbooks and stuff like that, because they're the older people with no video record. But your Beto O'Rourke does have sort of a social media past history that maybe an opponent
Yep,
wouldn't have.
exactly. It's a very interesting problem, and I think it'll be much better if we can trend towards, just letting some of this stuff go. I think it would be a lot worse if we just have a light switch, one day.
Yeah. Just to give you the final word here, and maybe what you just said would suffice, but how do we sort of start steering towards a society that thinks about political forgiveness in the way that you
I
would
would
like
like
to?
for anything that becomes a big issue to have a big meaning behind it, to be directly relevant to the candidate or the official of the organization or whatever, to their job. So I would like, when something comes up, us to take a look at it and say, all right, is this something a normal human being could have done even as a mistake, or is this a mark of some quality that we find unacceptable? And until we have that conversation ahead of time instead of now after the fact, it's going to continue to be chaotic.
Matthew Larosiere, insightful as always. Thanks so much for coming on
Thank you for
Underscored,
having me.
man. I appreciate it. All right, you can find Matt on Twitter at MattLaw at Law. MattLaw at Law. I'll spell it out for you in the show notes, and you can follow him there, and you can find out more about Young Voices at www.young-voices.com. I've been your host, Stephen Kent, and we'll be back later in the week with more Underscored. Until then, stay free.